even smaller after your exhibition.
Well, if you would know like what kind of troubles we have to tackle in that institution, if I would know, I don't know, I probably would not use boats force. So you can't build because it's falling apart, you can't build there because it's falling apart, it's a million problems. It's a whole building and not adjusted. So. It looks like because of the lower yeah, it looks impressive and one doesn't know and one doesn't touch. And as soon as you start to touch, you realize it's just fake walls, fake ceilings.
But also in this technique, there's only a few real walls. This is what most of the pieces it's real.
I see. So there's also fragile.
Yeah, but for light scenes that is what even pieces, because it's flexible. Real glass, I think
yes. Extremely. So they are doing their best, but they edit the limits with text. It's not possible because they don't know. So they continue, so I had something in my head.
Welcome in transit, welcome in the exhibition. This exhibition has, I think, it's a lucky coincidence, I think, that we have these two exhibitions at the same time in the same city, so that we can also see how different curators approach somehow comparative issues from a different point of view. I was not really starting with the idea to comment on the current situation, but of course the current situation is very, very important to read the exhibition. When I was asked to do this exhibition, this was exactly 1 year ago, when Judith Angel, the director of this gallery, she asked me to do an exhibition in this space. At the time, in April 2015, I was in the southern United States, in particular at the time in Louisiana, and there is a specific situation in Louisiana, but not only in this southern state, also in other states of the United States, where you can see very, very somehow transparently the historic continuation, the historic continuity of practices of exclusion and practices of submission of certain groups of people based on economic interests. So, of course, this era, the southern United States, was for more than 300 years dominated by the institution of slavery. Black people, Africans, then later on African American people, were enslaved for the profit of the early global capitalists. And the specific situation in Louisiana was that I could see how this tradition of exploiting a certain group of people on the basis of race, on the basis of a certain idea of difference in humankind, how this continues until today. I think there are not many places in the world where you can see it in this kind of dramatic way than in Louisiana. There are hundreds of former slave plantations where they were producing sugarcane, cotton, and so on. And on some of these plantations, you have now the contemporary prison industrial complex. So the huge prison systems in the United States. You know, it's the country where with the highest incarceration rate in the world, and there's a disproportionately high rate of black people or non-white people incarcerated. Not so much because of reasons of statistics of crime, but because they are much more likely to be sentenced to prison for various social and political reasons. And on one former plantation we have the biggest, the largest and the most infamous prison in the United States, the so-called Angola. Angola is the name of the region. It was named after the people, after the country where the slaves came from, African countries. And now you have a certain condition of forced labor by criminalizing certain groups and encamping them, imprisoning them for most of the time. So this was the colonial basis of my colonial history, post-colonial basis of my idea to do something about what I call the society of exclusion. And I wanted to bring together different moments in history, different geographic locations, and also, of course, very different artistic approaches to these issues. Ghost of the Civil Dead is the title of a film by Nick Cave. I think most of you will know Nick Cave, the singer. And in the 1980s, when I was a student, a young guy, 25 years old or so, I watched this film, and this was my first encounter with what is now called the prison industrial complex. It was a film on a high security prison in Australia, and it showed all the production of the exclusion of certain groups of people, but also the production of violence within the prison system. And this film, the title of the film, Ghost of the Civil Dead, somehow came back to my mind when thinking about a term that could somehow work as a generalization of conditions of living of different kinds of people who are not considered as regular citizens. That can be migrants, that can be prisoners, that can be refugees, that can be people in detention centers, that can be Roma people in Central Europe, and so on. So these people, this term social dead is a quite interesting term. That means these people are still, of course biologically they are still alive, but they are socially excluded. They are stripped bare of their civil rights, their possibilities of participating in social life, in politics, in cultural spheres, and so on. There are many other theoretical approaches by philosophers and other thinkers. You might also consider Giorgio Agamben's notion of the bare life, the la vida nuda, that is just the life, you have just the bodily life, but you are stripped bare under certain conditions of all the civil rights. And that was also, of course, one reason. Where does this come from? Where does this idea come from? This practice come from that could be named with such terms? And I would say it does derive from the system of colonialism and slavery. And the system of slavery is the one that lays the ground for our modern global capitalist system. Without the slaves in the working on the plantations and in the sugar mills in American countries and on the cotton plantations and so on, the global capitalism would not have developed as it did. And that's why the exhibition starts with the history about slavery. And as it is of course related to contemporary issues of migration and escape, it is not so much about the hard conditions of working, the brutal treatment of the slaves, but it is more about how to escape this system. And you will see the most, we see this also, it's more or less graphic work on the idea and the practice of escape. One of the most relevant refugee movements in history is the movement of the enslaved people to free states in the north of the United States. In the 19th century, basically, until the Civil War, when the system of slavery was abolished. So Christina Meissner is one of the artists I appreciate as an artist. Really, I appreciate her artistic approach, which is very much about the question: how can an artist deal with some problems that are hardly to imagine? I mean, it's really hard to imagine the conditions of slavery. And maybe you know some films about slavery, like the Tarantino film or the Steve McQueen film, 12 Years a Slave. And yet you always have the feeling that the idea of representation does not really work. So you cannot imitate this incredible situation of being enslaved, being treated like an object and being punished. I mean, you can maybe talk about it, but it's really hard to depict. And one of the approaches is focusing on a kind of geography of what I call the geography of liberation, which is the process of liberation that is very, very complicated, very complex. How people, we can really relate also to nowadays and to the roots people are trying to find and how they organize themselves. You mentioned that, how they organize, and also in the 19th century, people trying to escape this system of dehumanization organized very well, and the so-called Underground Railroad is the escape route, or the many escape routes of these people. And there were, for instance, in one of these, in the first one, you have quite detailed instructions how to find the way to freedom and how to meet other people who would assist you at certain places and so on. But for orientation, the most important thing for orientation during the night was the North Star, that you could find your way during the night when, of course, these people were followed and persecuted by so-called slave hunters, and they were always in danger and they had to hide. They were hiding in the woods, they were hiding in some. This is, we could make a reference between this box, which is a wooden box that was sent by mail or by ship, and some slaves would be hidden in this box. So we could make this reference to the container you have in your show. There's a long history, we could say, of, I don't know how to describe it, but of hiding in some
transportation devices that are supposed to transport other things than migrants and refugees.
I just realized, sorry for interruption, I just realized that both of our shows start with kind of a map. So map as a reference point. It was maybe an unconscious decision also for me to choose the map as one of the first things what people encounter when they...
Yeah, it's interesting. It's certainly by coincidence. We didn't talk about that, but it's somehow it's also logical. I mean, for me, it was not so much the idea of the map, but of the orientation. Also, I did this wall. This wall is usually it's not here in the space. The wall somehow forces you to find another way than the direct one. The direct is usually just this way, and so you get yourself somehow into a situation to organize yourself in space, and that this continues here. And the very important fact in the work of Christine Meissner is, of course, the cultural dimension. And you have here, for instance, the song "Wade in the Water." There are so many songs. These are the roots of our modern musical culture, the roots of blues and jazz and most of the other modern styles. When people who had to somehow they had to smart out the masters, so they had to write texts in an indirect way. They could not tell what they really wanted to say on a literal level, but they had always to somehow to translate it in the biblical language, in the language of the Bible. So when somebody was addressing the Ohio River as the border to freedom, they were not talking about Ohio River because, okay, the masters would have been very alert. There's somebody who wants to escape. So they were talking about the River Jordan. They were always translating everything into biblical language because this was the only culture allowed to the enslaved people. They could practice Christian religion, but nothing else. And they were forbidden of the African cultural expressions and so on.
And sorry, Christine
Meissner?
She's Austrian?
She's German.
She's German.
Yeah. And she did, for many, many years, she was working on issues of colonialism and slavery, also in Brazil and in Africa.
Okay,
and
so she was working.
She has a long history in this, yeah. And somehow it goes back to her own story as growing up in a culture, in a post Second World War, post-Nazi culture that was very much Americanized at the time, and she, or more, even more, of course, her father was all the time very much into jazz music and blues music and so on. And she was asking where is this coming from and what does it mean? What is the roots of all these cultures? So this is there's lots of research in it. Every detail is historical fact somehow, but it does not try to somehow represent the conditions.
I just realized it's a much more rural perspective here, because you also, as an Austrian, you refer to America. A German artist, she also refers to, I don't know, like rural issues, really American colonialism. And our show in Gonzalo is like really purely Eastern European, like the issue of colonialism is like very minimally discussed. It's,
but I noticed that
out of the discourse.
You have a nice reference in one of the photographic series in the entrance, in this hall,
yes.
Where there is a reference to migrants to Brazil, Slovak migrants to Brazil, and there is even a place called Matoslava.
Yes, it's a village somewhere in the middle of Brazil.
A village, so you have some, because you cannot avoid, this global dimension, I think, because also, as you said, with the weapon production and export of the weapons, it's also a global dimension of Slovak economy, of course. Yeah. And I think initially the idea of Nick Cave said and what George Agamben said later on also about these conditions of a non-citizen, a person is not considered a citizen, but just a body or whatever. This idea first came up on the condition, or in the research on slavery. So it was one very prominent researcher called Orlando Patterson who used the term social death already for the condition of the enslaved people. And yes, as I told you, I was starting with the idea of the prison as the maybe most concrete manifestation of inclusion and exclusion in society. Because when we think of exclusion, I think we should not only think of external exclusion, so making fences, building fences to prevent migrants to enter the country, but also many dimensions of internal exclusion. We mentioned the Roma situation, and we mentioned them later on. So there are also physically built walls against certain groups in your own society. And the prison is maybe one of the systems where the idea of, or the practice of what I would call with Angela Davis the racialized punishment, that is a punishment of people that is based on a certain idea of difference, comes, I think, to the most physical expression. And in Emma's work, Emma Wolukawa-Namba, she's a British artist with origins in Uganda. She grew up in Uganda, and she did a lot of research in late colonialism. And what is a colony? A colony is when you cannot describe it in a few words, but a colony is a country where one group, the colonizers, dominates another group, and there's only one group to be considered as citizens, and they are free to move, and the others, the majority, the colonized society, is considered as subject, not a citizen, and is deprived of any mobility. I think the idea of modernity is very much based on mobility, also on social mobility. Somebody who is not an aristocrat in the Middle Ages could not become anything in society. But in modern times, somebody who could make business and money could get some economic enterprise. He or she could somehow be very very mobile in the social system. And this modern mobility, modern bourgeois mobility we have since the 17th, 18th century in Europe is very much based on the profits of the early colonial and global economy. But the interesting research in Emma's work, I think, is that the prison, this is some images from an archive she found in London, the British Archive, documenting the idealized situation of prison in Uganda. And by analogy, you could call the colony, or we could call the prison as the ideal colony, because everybody is somehow in a confined space, and everybody is doing what the colonizers want them to do. This is from the late 1950s, when in reality you had lots of struggles and fights and anti-colonial wars at the time, or wars, guerrilla wars, and the British colonizers were still imagining the colony as a system to discipline the people, to educate the people, and to make ideal colonial subjects out of these African people. You see that everything is very much staged in these photographs, and they were used for propaganda issues, of course. They also did exhibitions where they showed their achievements in the modern prison system. And of course also they tried to make a difference between a so-called human, modern, civilized system of imprisonment in contrast to the old African or old system of punishment that was ruling in Africa before. So the idea of modernization is very much, and civilization is very much connected to this kind of educational institution of the prison. Of course, we can think of Michel Foucault's analysis of the society of discipline that was also somehow best manifested in the Panopticon. And then she was asking herself about this catalog cover. She found this catalog cover first from the Makerere Art Gallery, which is one of the first art institutions in Africa in the 50s, founded in the 50s by a British art educator to create modern African artists. Also an interesting colonial approach to cultural production. And she was doing research on these art schools, and then she was asking herself why in such a catalogue there would be some images of prison systems. Quite strange somehow. Yeah. And this was the start of her research, and then finally she really could make contact to the artist who was, as a very young student at the time in the art school, who was commissioned by the local government, the prison administration, to do these paintings for an official exhibition celebrating the achievements of British colonialism in Uganda. So the camp, the prison, the camp, there is this term by Nicholas Mirsov, an Australian writer, who speaks of the empire of the camp that we have today. We could also speak of an empire of walls, an empire of fences, and so on. And my idea was that because Vienna, Bratislava, this is only a few kilometers from each other, but in between there was the Iron Curtain for many decades, as we all know. And the idea was, or the kind of observation, that after the fall of the Iron Curtain, after the fall of the Berlin Wall in around 1990, the project to build walls and fences really accelerated. And the whole world was, after this, was being divided by walls and fences. This is very interesting, and I quoted Etienne Balibar, the French philosopher, in my text for the booklet, who even in 1989 said that after the fall of the wall and the Iron Curtain, he spoke that in the near future there would be another Iron Curtain that would be located in the eastern Mediterranean. This was his kind of prediction in the late 1980s, which is really strong. And with the creation of the Schengen Empire, we are starting about building this Iron Curtain through the Mediterranean. So, but we also have it in Israel and Palestine, this idea of the wall. We have it in USA and Mexico. We have it in so many other places. We have it also within our own, as we mentioned already, in our own societies, like with the Roma communities. So I wanted to go back to one, not an artist, but a sociologist, Pierre Bourdieu, who I think was one of the first thinkers or writers who very substantially examined the idea of the camp and the praxis of the camp in relation to colonialism and migration. And I have this series of, he did I think a few thousand photographies when he was a very young researcher working in Algeria around 1960, late 50s, early 60s. And you know, at the time there was the Algerian War of Independence. It was a French colony still, and he was, as part of his military service, he came to Algeria and he had to do some bureaucratic work, and he started his ethnographic and sociological practice there. And what he mainly, but not only, but my selection is based on this, mainly studied was the so-called resettlement camps. And the French administration, colonial administration, they uprooted and resettled about 1/3 or 1/4 of the whole Algerian population, so this was 2.5 million people nearly, were uprooted, resettled to other places in order to control the society. So they built a number of, you see these camps, a number of camps with the idea to control the people and the movement of the people in order to control the land as a whole, the nation, the economy and everything. There was resistance going on from the countrysides, from the small villages. They had lots of guerrilla fighting activities, and so to break this resistance also, it was in the conception of the colonizer, it was important to resettle people, to break their social relations, to put them into very new conditions where they could live still physically, of course, and they could also work for the colonizers, but they could not continue their social conditions and their family conditions and so on. And Pierre Bourdieu was mainly interested in how this uprooting, he was speaking of the uprooted society, the déracinement, the uprooting of people, of the whole society, how this affected the whole life and the whole habitus, the family relations, the gender relations, the relations between the old and the young, and so on. And to make it short, these many camps where we had more than 2 million people encamped, or maybe we can also say imprisoned, these are the roots of modern migration to Europe, we could say. The modern post-colonial migration to Europe, when after colonialism, but still in the late times of colonialism, many of these people who were in these camps, they didn't go back to their homes because their homes were either destroyed or they could not live there anymore because they had socially changed. They moved to Europe. They moved to the big cities in Europe. They moved to Paris and other French capitals, major cities. And so they were resettled again in the outskirts of these big cities, what we now are used to know as the so-called banlieue. And again, we have a separation, somehow a social segregation of people, migrants in the outskirts, locals, French in the city centers. So I think this is a link between the contemporary forms of migration and the colonial history.
I can understand the thematic link, but I want to ask you as a curator the aesthetic question, or maybe a curatorial question, because this was not meant as artwork, I suppose. Like,
yes,
we didn't really compose it. Also, the pictures are rather documentary. I assume they were from the book rather, or maybe for some archive. I don't know. Do you know?
The history of these photographs is the following: that Pierre Bourdieu was, as I said, he did a few thousands, I think. He had some boxes full of photographs. Many of them were not developed yet, and some of the photographs he used to illustrate his own writings. Also interesting that the French originals of his writings are very often illustrated with images, but for instance all the German translations, they do not have any images because of different publication policies and so on. But only in his late days, a few years before he died, the people from Camera Austria in Graz, and one student of him, Franz Schultheiss, who knew very well about the photographs, they convinced him to do an archive, to do a proper archive with these photographs. And then they had the first exhibition I think in 2003, and they started to put it like this in this format, and so I had to. These were somehow the conditions of the lenders in this case. I had to do it like this. Also the text.
So the Camera
relation of
Austria,
text.
they are the lenders.
Yes,
who just
there is the Bourdieu archive, and they have I think all of his photographs.
But usually they are exhibited in the photographic documentary context, or it's rather like purely documentary.
I'm not really sure, but I think I hope I'm not wrong in this, but I think it's the first time that Bourdieu's photographs are included in a group exhibition, because usually they only have a Bourdieu exhibition, a traveling Bourdieu exhibition, and they have of course many more on show, but I could only do a small exhibition. Also, I wanted to focus on the camps and the relations between late colonialism and post-colonial migration, and
I see the approach that you also had to kind of make the step out of art context to illustrate your narrative with some maybe documentary photographic element. Is that so? Or you also observe them as aesthetics?
I would have found, I think, many other artists with a photographic approach. You also have many in your show. But I didn't want to have an artist with a photographic approach. I think it's much more a sociological approach to document situations as a kind of source material for further elaboration in writing or in thinking or whatever. You see that all of the other works are not photographic. I mean, if they are performative. And this kind of documentation idea, I somehow wanted to delegate it to the scientist and not so much to the artist. But the real reason is that I think that it is such an important work he did in the 50s and early 60s, and it's still not very well known by many. And it's, I think, there are not many academics and not many writers that who were dealing with these issues that early and that precisely as he did. Because, I mean, of course, it's much more complex than I could describe it now in this very brief introduction. But he is analyzing the economy, the cultural dimensions, the bodily incorporation of the social system and the social relations, or loss of social relations, and then it's that is the migration issue, and of course I don't know many historical works documenting the camp as one of the critically documenting the camp as one of the central motives of the modern idea of society, the society of inclusion and exclusion. Because, of course, for instance, you know, I think it comes from colonialism. Also, the concentration camp was first of all, we had it in Africa, in African colonies, the term concentration camp was coined in the African colonies. Of course, they did not do the same than the Nazis did at the time, but it was also imprisonment, punishment on a racial basis, and there is this colonial tradition of the camp, and I think we should keep it in mind or refer back to it. Okay, jetzt, now I change to one aspect of internal exclusion with Robert Gabriel's work on describe on what subject. Robert is a Slovak artist who lives in Vienna. He studied in Bratislava and later he finished his studies in Vienna at the Art Academy. And he is of the Roma community, and he grew up in a segregated school, in a segregated educational institution that was considered the proper place for, I don't know how to call it, not real Slovaks, of course mainly populated by Roma people at the time. So he has this experience of a kind of physical exclusion, but his father spent most of the time of the last decades in prison, and he was the main tattooer of the prison. He tattooed his own body and he tattooed the bodies of his co-inmates. And the technique of tattooing the body is considered by the artist as one technique to find a language to tell your own story. His father tells something, I mean, this is of course only a selection of motives, but he tells about his life, he tells about his relations, about his past, about his hopes, and about his, I think something of this is translated also to Slovak, what he has written here of the engraving of the life and the lost social life into one's own skin. Again, the prison becomes a model for the exclusion in society of the whole group. What is interesting, I think, in the technical approach by Robert is the translation of the bodily engraving into the very traditional technique of etching. So he somehow translates a non-artistic practice of drawing into art to give a voice to somebody who usually does not have any voice. I think in one of my last tours I mentioned the post-colonial writer Gayatri Spivak. There's one very, very famous text of her which is called "Can the Subaltern Speak?" This is really the question if the most suppressed groups in society, if they have any means of articulation of their own situations and their own problems and their own demands and so on. And I think this work is very much related to who has a voice, who doesn't have a voice, and if somebody tries and can make it to form a language, to say something, if there are others to listen to it. And I think this is really his project, to give a voice to, I mean, in this case it's his father, but of course it's representative of the whole group. Yeah. Mulugeta Kidan, he is an Ethiopian artist, and he developed this work when he was on a residency in Vienna for a couple of months. And he stayed at a place where many refugees are working. It's a kind of alternative hotel run by Austrian Caritas. And so he could come very, very closely in contact with refugees also from his own region, from Ethiopia, from Eritrea, and so on. And then he, this was last year in the middle of the very intense migration refugee movement of last year. And then he positioned himself in front of popular monuments, public places, as somehow as a public sculpture, wearing the life vest you already know from Blanker's exhibition. I think that's very easy to understand. I don't have to talk about too much. Maybe I'll give another anecdote. When Mulugeta was here for the opening days, we were walking the city for 3 days or so, and he was always looking for a black person, because he was always the only one. And in every other city, you are used to encounter black persons, but he did not, and he always said, I can't find any black person, but the first one I would meet, I will make a photograph. This was his project for these days he spent here, but it was in vain, he didn't find any.
I found one.
Did you?
Yeah, but the one refused to.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Okay, so this is interesting.
Photograph, yeah, so.
But then last time, when I missed my train at the station and I had to wait for quite some time, for me it was the first time that I had a more serious look at the painting you have at the station. There is a very huge wall painting, a mural, which was done in 1960, and there you have black people. Mm-hmm. This is really interesting. From the socialist point of view, the socialist idea of internationalism, you have many black people in the...
But only the friendly communist countries, so they were represented.
Yeah, we also have Asians, but of course there is the ideological motive of socialism is liberating the suppressed countries, but not only the workers from capitalism, but also the colonized from imperialism. So, but I think in relation to what's going on nowadays, it's very interesting to refer to this painting, because it was very inclusive. It was very, maybe I don't know if it was only on an ideological level, or we should relate this also to a more material basis.
It was just a bubble, I would say, and like now the discussion is also happening in the bubble, because the real problem of the refugees or the foreigners living here, it's not really existing, or it's not existing in a large scale. And at that time it was also a bubble, the illusion that everybody lives side by side happily ever after. But we had such a little percentage of foreigners or black people or any different cultures that we could not really talk about multicultural society. And nowadays it's also
But it would be worse, I think it would be worse to do more research on what really happened during these decades with international relations with African and Asian countries. And because I know from others, from Moscow for instance, I know that, I have never been there, but I know that from the African context, that so many African filmmakers and artists and I don't know, writers were studying there, and they were for them it was really very important. But also in Prague, Indian artists went to Prague. They had connections because the anti-imperial ideology or the anti-imperial politics of the Soviets. It was of great importance for the colonized, for the anti-colonial movement, even if it might have been just ideology for the country itself. I don't know. Yeah, we have one more artwork. I will only, we cannot watch it together. It's a field, it's a video done by Yuri Schaden, Austrian artist. It's about a detention center in the Austrian province of Styria, and he's focusing on the surrounding, the cultural and social and political surroundings of this detention center, not so much depicting what's going on there. Even at the time it was just under construction when he did it, but it's more interested in the economic conditions and the political conditions of its construction. So interesting aspect of this video is that the detention center is built in an era that is somehow under social or economical transformation. There are so many unemployed people, so people have to leave. They somehow have to migrate, and the remaining people and the politicians in the area are very happy to have a detention center, because that would improve their own economic situation, because it would create jobs, it would create infrastructure and so on. So there is a very economic approach to the construction of a detention center in the Austrian province, and I think it is representative for many other similar facilities. At least in Austria, I know that it is the case. We have many places that are housing refugees that are not basically not built or not run for political reasons or for housing the refugees, but they are just kind of subsidized, run-down hotels, and the former owners of these hotels are very happy to be paid by the state, but of course they are not treating the refugees as they would treat the former guests of the hotel. So, okay, thank you very much. I stop.
Thank you.
Thank you. But take a glass of wine and then you can have some discussion and some questions or whatever you want.